Have you ever wondered what truly lurks behind the thin veil separating our world from the unknown? In the shadows of forgotten cities, beneath the ruins of ancient mansions, and inside the quiet corners of the human mind, something watches, something remembers, and something hungers. Tonight, we descend into 3 of Lovecraft's most haunting visions, stories, where art becomes too real, where identity shatters like broken glass, and where an entire bloodline slips into the darkness beneath the earth. These are not merely tales of monsters, they are warnings, whispers that the terrifying is often closer than we think. What if a painter's masterpiece is not imagination, but a portrait drawn from life? What if the creature everyone fears is the reflection you've never dared to see? And what if the past of a forgotten family still crawls beneath the soil, waiting for the thunder to call it home? Prepare yourself. The descent begins now. I remember the night I first spoke of. Pickman truly spoke of him. I mean, because the storm outside was just like tonight's, restless, heavy, and loud enough to make every window in my house tremble, as though something were testing the glass. It was the kind of night when shadows appear thicker than they should be, and the old fireplaces seem to whisper if you listen too long. Maybe that is why I finally agreed to tell Elliot everything. Or perhaps, deep down, I knew the truth would rot inside me if I didn't let it out. You fool. Warren is dead. The phrase from an old tale echoed through my mind as I poured tea neither of us would drink. For once, you have seen what I've seen. Tea, warmth, comfort, the familiar rhythms of everyday life. None of it fits quite right anymore. You asked me why I cut all ties with Richard Upton Pickman, why I stopped attending the art club, why I refused every invitation that led anywhere near the North End. You wrote to me like a worried guardian, insisting there must have been a misunderstanding, some petty scandal or artistic disagreement. You thought I was being dramatic. You thought it was simply the gossip surrounding his ghoul-feeding piece, that infamous painting the club refused to exhibit. But no, it wasn't the painting, not truly. It was what lay beneath it, what stood behind it, what breathed in its shadows. Pickman was no ordinary grotesque artist. Boston has known melancholics, eccentrics, expressionists, romanticists, and madmen, but none of them, none ever captured the anatomy of terror the way he did. Most illustrators merely imagine horror. Pickman knew it. He painted with the precision of someone who had studied these abominations with the same dedication an anatomist gives to bones and sinew. Every brushstroke had depth, weight, memory. His art wasn't fantasy. It was revelation. Even now I can hear him laughing that strange, low laugh he gave when Reed once asked him where he found inspiration for such things. Reed, pompous as ever, always had theories: pathological neurosis, biological atavism, hereditary madness, malnourishment, nonsense that never came close to the truth. Pickman simply smiled, bared his teeth, and answered only, "Nature is deeper than you think." A harmless phrase on its surface, yet something in the way he spoke it made my skin crawl, as if the floorboards had shifted beneath me. I admired him then. God help me, I admired him greatly. His paintings had a realism so cruelly faithful that even those who prided themselves on being unshakable felt compelled to avert their eyes. It wasn't just the distorted figures or the morbid settings. It was the sense that something in those portraits was alive, as if the creatures trapped in pigment were waiting for the right moment to breathe again. But none of that was enough to sever our friendship. Not yet. The truth began to reveal itself on a rain-choked night, when Pickman let me see the side of Boston most residents pretend does not exist. Back Bay isn't Boston, he told me. Not the real Boston. Not the one that grew from graves and fear and witches' breath. He spoke of old tunnels beneath the North End, of forgotten cellars that connected houses to the sea, of bricked-up wells that were never meant to be reopened. He talked of these things casually, as if every artist keeps a secret map of haunted corridors behind his easel. Then He invited me to his other studio. "Newbury Street is for display," he said. "But art, real art, is born where memory clings to the walls." We walked through the maze of ancient alleyways long after midnight, our footsteps soaked in the smells of damp brick and centuries-old refuse. The streets tightened around us like a throat. Pickman navigated them with unsettling ease, turning corners that seemed to loop impossibly into one another, until I suspected the city was folding itself around him like a living thing. The building he brought me to looked nearly ready to collapse. A Sicilian landlord had rented it to him under the name Peters, and every window had been sealed with planks. The front door was a swollen, worm-eaten plank barely hanging by its hinges. When it shut behind us, the sound was final, too final. Inside, the air was thick with cold earth, oil, and something metallic that flickered at the edge of my senses. Pickman lit a lamp, its glow casting monstrous silhouettes along the paneled walls. "Make yourself at home," he said, though no one could be at home in such a place. His forbidden paintings hung everywhere, and this, Elliot, is the first moment my nerves truly faltered. I have seen disturbing works. I have witnessed macabre art, medical dissections, the horrors of war itself. But nothing prepared me for what Pickman kept hidden here. The subjects in his canvases were humanoid only in the loosest sense, crouched and slumping forward like beasts caught midway through learning to walk upright. Their textures suggested something rubbery, damp, and ancient. The eyes, when present, gleamed with cunning hunger. They were feeding, always feeding. On what? I refused to say. Yet the worst thing was not their bodies. It was their faces, expressions so vivid, so animate, so horribly deliberate, that I found myself fighting the instinct to step back, afraid they might climb out of the frames. Pickman watched my reaction with satisfaction, as though he'd been waiting to confirm something. "Art is truth," he murmured, "but truth is rarely welcome." Lightning cracked outside. The entire room seemed to pulse with it, and somewhere deeper in the house, I swear this on my life, I heard something move. Pickman only smiled. "Come," he said. "There's more below." I wish I had turned and run then. I wish I had never followed him down those rotting wooden stairs into the cellar. But curiosity is a wicked thing. It leads men into graves, into madness, into truths they were never meant to see. And that night, it led me into Pickman's true world, the one his paintings had merely hinted at, the one that lives beneath Boston still. If I had known then what waited for me in the dark, perhaps the storm outside wouldn't terrify me now. Perhaps I wouldn't flinch every time the floorboards creak or the lights flicker. But that is the burden of knowing, Elliot. Once the veil lifts, even a little, you can never convince yourself it was only imagination. Not when you've seen the eyes looking back at you. The descent into Pickman's cellar felt less like walking into another room and more like slipping behind the skin of the city itself. The stairs creaked beneath our feet with the brittle protest of old wood that had been forced to bear more weight than it ever wished to. Each step downward dulled the lamplight, swallowing it inch by inch until the glow felt fragile, an intruder in a place that preferred the dark. I could smell the age of the place before I could see it. Cold earth, old stone, and the faintest lingering trace of dampness that clings to places untouched by sun or wind. Pickman moved ahead with an ease that seemed deeply unnatural for a man walking into such shadows, as though the gloom recognized him and parted in familiar welcome. When the steps finally gave way to level ground, I found myself standing before a broad cellar chamber that stretched farther than any basement beneath a simple house should. "This is where I paint," Pickman said, though his voice felt subdued, almost reverent. He lifted the lamp, and its trembling glow revealed another gallery of horrors, unfinished canvases, scattered sketches, and blocks of color that hinted at shapes no sane mind would attempt to render. These were different from the paintings upstairs. The works above felt final terrible visions completed with painstaking detail. But the pieces down here, they were alive in another way, raw, breathing, as if the very act of painting them required Pickman to wrestle something from the dark and the struggle had been captured in every jagged line and half-formed silhouette. I remember shuddering despite myself when I saw one canvas propped against the stone wall. It depicted a group of creatures crouched in a narrow tunnel, their limbs twisted and sinewy, with jaws too wide and eyes too reflective. They were not feeding in this one, nor leaping, nor stalking. They were watching, waiting, and the way Pickman had captured the shine of their eyes, it looked almost as though a flash of real light had struck living pupils. He noticed my stare. "Perspective is everything," he said, tapping the board lightly. "You have to understand how they move, how they look at you. Otherwise, the work loses its truth." There was something in that word, truth, that made my breath catch slightly. Pickman said it not as an artist committed to realism, but as a witness describing an event, as though these monsters were not inventions, but acquaintances. We drifted deeper into the cellar, the lamp guiding us through a maze of wooden beams and ancient brickwork, shadows twined around each support column like restless serpents. As my eyes adjusted, I realized there were relics of the house's original construction tucked away in corners, rusted hinges, warped boards, and crumbling stone foundations that looked centuries old. The place felt wrong in its proportions, too wide, too deep, too elaborate for a common dwelling. "This house knows things," Pickman murmured. "It remembers. Some places cling to their history, especially those that were built before the ground beneath them settled." I wanted to ask what he meant, but a sudden shape caught my eye. It was a large, circular structure built into the stone floor, a well, not the charming kind found in old gardens or quaint villages. This one was bricked in a perfect ring, its opening covered by a thick wooden disc whose edges were darkened by age and moisture. Something about it made my skin tighten. It felt like a lid, a barrier, a warning. Pickman stepped past it with a casualness that sent a thin jolt of fear through me. "One of the reasons I chose this place," he said. "Old wells like this often lead to interesting architectural surprises, sections of the city that were never meant to be mapped." The cellar air pressed in around me. "You mean tunnels?" "Tunnels, chambers, crawl spaces, forgotten basements. The city is full of them. And beneath the city—" He paused, his eyes gleaming in the lamplight. "Beneath the city is another world entirely." He moved on before I could respond, though I felt the weight of the words reverberate in the stillness. We stepped into the main studio space, where unfinished canvases leaned against every wall. The lamp cast them into motion, shadows flickering across the surfaces until the creatures inside them looked as though they shifted under the changing light. On one easel stood a massive painting draped by a heavy cloth. Even covered, it radiated a kind of malignant energy. Pickman approached it with an almost ceremonial slowness, grasped the cloth, and pulled it aside. I hadn't meant to cry out, but something primal tore the sound from my throat. The thing in the painting dwarfed the horrors I'd seen before. Not merely humanoid, not merely beast-like. It was something that defied categories altogether. It crouched in mid-motion, its claws sunk into a limp human form, its eyes burning with a malevolent intelligence. Every brushstroke radiated vitality. Every detail of its posture and expression screamed of a creature mid-act, alive with cruel purpose. And worst of all, it felt like the creature could step out of the canvas if the air grew colder or the shadows deepened just a little. "This is the most ambitious piece," Pickman whispered, running a hand along the frame. "Hardest to capture. They don't like being still for long." "They?" I managed. My voice felt weak, fragile. "Pickman, what exactly are you painting?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached toward the corner of the canvas, where a small piece of paper had been pinned. It was curled, as though recently handled. I moved to see it, thinking it might be a photograph of an old ruin or a night street, something he'd use for reference. But Pickman's hand snapped out, grasping my wrist with surprising force. "Not yet," he said sharply. "You're not ready." His grip released a moment later, but his eyes, His eyes lingered with something between warning and pity. The cellar walls seemed suddenly alive, with faint noises, a subtle scuffling, a scrape, a whisper of displaced dirt or stone. "Rats," Pickman said softly, though he didn't sound convinced. "Old places like this have their share, but I had heard rats before. These sounds were too deliberate, too heavy. They came from beneath the wooden disc covering the well." Pickman stiffened. For the first time since we entered the studio, unease crossed his face, a flicker of tension. He drew a small revolver from his coat, motioned for silence, and stepped toward the main cellar room. The lamp trembled in my hand. The darkness swelled around me like rising water, and in that moment, standing alone amid the canvases of creatures too lifelike to be imagined, I began to understand the truth Pickman had been dancing around all night. He wasn't painting nightmares, he was documenting them, and somewhere in that cellar, beyond the reach of the lamplight, one of his subjects was moving. Pickman slipped out of the studio and into the main cellar with a swiftness that betrayed more than concern. It was instinctive, like a man returning to a role he had rehearsed many times. The door closed behind him, leaving me alone in that suffocating chamber where half-formed horrors gazed from the walls with eyes that seemed far too aware. For a moment I stood frozen, listening to the muted rumble of the storm overhead and to the strange, uneven rhythm of movement coming from somewhere beyond the door. The air pressed against my chest with a density that felt almost physical. I clutched the lamp so tightly my fingers ached. Then the sounds grew clearer, not the soft, skittering patter of rats, not the frantic rustling of vermin gnawing wood or scurrying across stone. These were slower, heavier, broken by occasional wet sliding noises that made my stomach tighten. It was as though something was brushing the underside of the floor, dragging itself along the hidden architecture beneath the house. Something with weight, something with intent. A faint clatter echoed from the direction of the old well, the boarded opening in the cellar floor I had tried not to look at for too long. I stared at the wooden disc now, the way it trembled almost imperceptibly, as if touched by a breeze that didn't exist. I stepped back instinctively, my heart pounding with a rhythm so frantic it seemed to echo inside my skull. And then the house went silent, utterly silent. The oppressive quiet felt worse than the noises, worse than the half-formed footsteps, worse than the scraping beneath the stones. It carried a sense of anticipation, as though the darkness itself was holding its breath, waiting. I forced myself to breathe slowly. The lamplight flickered as if reacting to my fear. Every painting in the room seemed to lean closer, their grotesque inhabitants craning outward, almost eager to witness what might happen next. When the door finally creaked open again, I nearly dropped the lamp. Pickman stood in the doorway, the revolver still in his hand. His eyes narrowed in concentration. "Rats," he said after a pause, but his tone lacked conviction. His voice carried a fine tremor, barely noticeable unless one listened closely, something I had never heard from him before. "Big ones. The tunnels here connect to the old network beneath the north end. No surprise the place stirs on a night like this." He waited as though expecting me to accept this explanation completely, but of course I didn't. His unease was unmistakable. Whether he meant to hide it or not, it betrayed him. He closed the door behind him gently, almost too gently, as though he feared making noise. Then he returned to the studio, his features arranged into a smile that felt practiced. "Come," he said, "there is one more piece I want to show you." But I couldn't move just yet. My eyes had drifted again to the enormous painting, the crouched creature gnawing at its victim, and then back to the curled paper pinned to its edge. Pickman noticed. His smile faded for an instant, a brief flicker of something darker replacing it, but he kept walking, the lamplight following him. I swallowed hard and followed. The next chamber was smaller, narrower, with low beams overhead that looked ready to collapse. The walls sweated with moisture. Pickman lit another lamp, its yellow glow revealing a collection of photographs pinned across a makeshift corkboard. For a moment, my mind couldn't process what I was seeing. The images weren't artistic references. They weren't dreamy landscapes or dramatic shadows meant to inspire composition. They were photographs of the very scenes Pickman had painted. Not sketches, not staged models. Photographs, old graveyards at night, vacant alleyways, forgotten tunnels beneath the city. In each image, there was the suggestion of motion caught at the corner of the frame, something slipping just out of sight, something blurred and twisted. You took these?" I whispered. Pickman nodded. "It helps to understand how they occupy space. Light, angles, timing." "They?" I repeated, my throat suddenly dry. Pickman hesitated. That hesitation alone frightened me more than anything else. It cracked the illusion of eccentricity he had worn like a coat. When he finally spoke, it was in a low voice, almost reverent. "There are creatures older than the city," he said. "Older than the graves, older than the tunnels men carved and forgot. They adapt, they survive, and sometimes," his eyes gleamed with something feverish, "sometimes they let themselves be seen." I took a step back. "Pickman, this is madness." "Is it?" His tone sharpened. "You've seen my paintings. You know they are not illusions. You know no imagination could conjure such authenticity." Lightning crackled across the sky above us. The cellar walls illuminated for a moment, stretching grotesque shadows across the studio. In that flash, I saw the stark sincerity in Pickman's face, the certainty of a man who has peered into depths no human should ever witness. I tried to steady my breathing. "Pickman, where do you find them?" "Sometimes," he said, "they find me." The words hung in the air like a chill. Before I could respond, another sound reverberated through the cellar, louder this time, like something heavy falling against stone. Pickman went rigid. The revolver was back in his hand before I even saw him reach for it. "Stay here," he whispered. His voice had lost all artistic mystique. Now it was sharp, survival-focused. "Do not follow me." Without waiting for a reply, he slipped out of the room again, vanishing down the narrow passageway toward the well. As soon as he was gone, the shadows swelled in the corners like living things. I held the lamp high, trying to push the darkness away, but it clung stubbornly to the edges of the room. Minutes passed, or perhaps seconds. Time felt distorted. Every drop of water that slid down the stone wall echoed like a footstep. Every flicker of the flame felt like breath brushing my cheek. Then, abruptly, the cellar trembled. Not violently, just enough for the wooden beams overhead to groan. A faint rumble rose from the depths beneath the floor, almost like a distant growl muffled by centuries of earth. "Pickman?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. Only the storm overhead, the soft hiss of the lamp, and a new sound. A sound that made my blood run cold. From the direction of the well, something scraped against the underside of the wooden cover, something that was testing it, finding its edges, pushing. My breath froze. Pickman's warnings, his half-spoken truths, his horrible art, all of it clicked into place in an instant. He wasn't painting fantasies. He wasn't imagining horrors. He was documenting a species hidden beneath Boston, something feral, ancient, hungry, something that now seemed to know I was here. And as the scraping grew louder, slow, deliberate, insistent, I knew with dreadful certainty that if the wooden disc lifted even an inch, I would see one of Pickman's subjects with my own eyes. The scraping beneath the well cover grew louder, turning from a soft testing of the wood into a firmer, more deliberate pressure, as though whatever lurked below had decided that subtlety was no longer necessary. The wooden disc trembled under each push. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to flee. But terror holds a man in place just as effectively as chains. The moment stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. "Pickman!" I called again, louder this time, my voice cracking. Still no answer. Lightning flashed through the cracks of the boarded windows upstairs, and for a heartbeat, the entire cellar lit up in stark white, exposing every shadow like a memory caught off guard. The scraping stopped, and that, somehow, was worse. Silence returned with a weight that pressed against my skull. I strained to hear, praying for nothing, fearing everything. My grip tightened on the lamp, the metal warm under my trembling palms. When the silence finally broke, it wasn't by a sound, it was by the sight of something fluttering near my foot, a small, curled piece of paper, the same paper I had seen pinned to the monstrous canvas earlier. In the chaos, I must have knocked it loose. For a long moment, I merely stared at it, as though expecting it to move on its own. After all, everything else in this cellar seemed ready to. Finally, I bent to pick it up. The edges were brittle, the surface gritty with dust. As I slowly uncurled it, the lamplight revealed the faint outline of an image, a photograph, but not of a street, or a graveyard, or a ruined chamber. It was of a creature exactly like the one in the painting. Curved spine, hunched posture, claws extended, face contorted in an expression of grotesque cunning. It wasn't motion blurred, it wasn't distorted, it wasn't a trick of light or shadow. It was clear, too clear. There was no mistaking the glistening texture of its skin, no denying the oily sheen of its eyes, or the way the lamplight had once reflected off its hunched shoulders the moment the shutter clicked. This wasn't an imagined monster. This was a portrait taken from life. A cold wave of dread washed over me. My breath hitched, and my hands began to shake so violently the lamp flickered. The idea that Pickman had painted from life, that the nightmares in his canvases had been posed models, was more horrifying than anything I had dared to consider. A sudden thud from the far side of the cellar sent me whirling toward the darkness, the lamp trembling in my hand. Something was moving beyond the reach of the light, its presence suggested only by a shift in the air and the faintest scrape against stone. "Pickman, where are you?" I whispered hoarsely. My mind raced. If the photograph was real, then nothing in this cellar was truly motionless. Nothing in this house was truly abandoned. The tunnels Pickman spoke of, the well he stepped around so casually, the ancient brickwork, all of it hinted at a subterranean world that had existed long before Boston's modern streets. Another sound, this time a faint, almost playful tapping, came from the direction of the studio doorway. I turned slowly, lifting the lamp higher, willing myself to face whatever stood there. But it wasn't a creature, it was Pickman, or rather, it was his silhouette, emerging from the darkness like a figure painted into the world by a trembling hand. His revolver hung loosely in his grip, and his expression was unreadable, though something in his eyes told me he had seen far more than he wanted to. "You shouldn't have touched that," he said softly, his gaze fixed on the photograph now trembling in my hand. "I had to know," I replied, my voice barely holding steady. "You photographed them. God, Pickman, you photographed them." He stepped closer, his shadow stretching over the stone floor. "Art demands honesty. Imagination alone can't capture the anatomy of fear. Not properly, not truthfully." I stared at him in disbelief. "So you found them? Or they found you?" Pickman's jaw tightened. "They live beneath us, in the tunnels, in the cracks, in the places where the earth remembers old things. I stumbled into their world years ago, and rather than kill me, they watched, studied me. As I studied them." "That's madness," I whispered. "You're risking your life." "No," he said with a strange calm. "I'm honoring theirs." Before I could answer, a deep grinding noise reverberated through the floorboards. The wooden disc covering the well jerked an inch sideways, an inch too far. A thin puff of stale air rose from the opening, carrying with it a scent of damp stone and something else, something sour, metallic, alive. Pickman reacted instantly, raising the revolver and stepping toward the well. "Stay behind me," he ordered sharply. The wooden cover shifted again. A low, hoarse exhale, almost like a breath, escaped from the darkness beneath it. The scraping resumed, harder now, more frantic, as though whatever lurked below sensed movement above and wished desperately to emerge. Pickman fired a single shot into the wood. The explosion echoed through the cellar, rattling beams and shaking dust from the ceiling. For a moment, all movement ceased. The air was thick with gunpowder and the scent of disturbed earth. Then, a hiss that rose from beneath the boards, vibrating with a cold intelligence. Pickman took a step back, his face pale. "It's hungry," he murmured. "The storm wakes them. The thunder agitates them. They think it's a summons." Thunder cracked overhead as if on cue, a violent roar that rattled the bricks. The cellar trembled again, not from the storm, but from something beneath us responding to it. The well cover jerked a full 2 inches this time. My heart lurched into my throat. Pickman grabbed my arm. "We're leaving. Now." He dragged me through the narrow passageway and toward the stairs. Behind us, the scraping grew louder, more urgent, accompanied by guttural sounds that suggested limbs brushing stone, claws testing gaps, bodies heaving through tight subterranean spaces. The shadows on the walls swayed as if they too were trying to flee. As we reached the first step, I couldn't help glancing back one last time. The wooden disc was shifting, slowly, deliberately, and from beneath it, in the sliver of darkness now exposed, I saw them, 2 eyes, reflective, shining, not with animal mindlessness, but with recognition, with hunger, with the unmistakable awareness of something that had seen us and wanted to see us again. Pickman yanked me upward before the wooden cover could move another inch. "Don't look back," he hissed. "Not if you value your life. They know you now." As the cellar door slammed shut behind us and the storm howled above, one truth crystallized like ice in my blood. Pickman's art was imitation, but his models were real, and one of them had finally found a way to reach the surface. We stumbled through the labyrinth of alleys like 2 fugitives escaping a war-torn city, though the only enemy was hidden below ground and the battlefield was a rotting cellar. The storm above had reached its furious crescendo, the thunder rolling so hard that windows rattled in their frames and the streets glittered with broken raindrops. Pickman moved quickly, barely glancing over his shoulder, gripping my arm with a steadiness that belied the terror we had left behind. His pace felt urgent, almost frantic, but always purposeful. He knew these alleys like the veins inside his own body. At some point, we emerged into a wider street with uneven cobblestones and shuttered tenements leaning toward each other like conspirators. A single lamppost flickered ahead, its dim yellow light distorted through the curtain of rain. Pickman slowed only when he reached it, releasing his hold on me as if the light provided some small measure of safety. "This way," he muttered, pointing toward a set of steps that led up to the elevated train platform. "If we're lucky, we'll catch the last shuttle." I nodded numbly. My mind was too full of images, the shifting well cover, the hiss from below, those gleaming eyes to form words. Even the storm couldn't drown out the echo of that scraping. It replayed in my head with tormenting clarity. We walked in silence toward the elevated, the storm growling above us. Once, when lightning illuminated the street, I caught a glimpse of Pickman's face. He didn't look frightened anymore, just weary. His expression tightened around an old truth he had carried for years. That revelation frightened me more than anything else. He had known all along. On the train ride back, the few passengers stared out the rain-lined windows, oblivious to the secret world crawling beneath their city. Pickman sat across from me, breathing hard, his revolver still tucked in his coat. He never spoke. He didn't need to. We both knew the only thing keeping the horror underground had been a flimsy wooden disc and the storm's temporary lull. When we finally parted ways near Beacon Street, the storm had faded into a soft drizzle. Pickman paused under a flickering street lamp and turned to me. "Forget tonight," he said, his voice low but firm. "Pretend you never came with me. Pretend you never saw the cellar." "How can I forget something like that?" I whispered. He held my gaze, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw something fragile flicker in his eyes, something that almost resembled regret. "You forget," he said, "because remembering will undo you." And just like that, he turned and disappeared down the street, swallowed by the thinning mist. I watched him until his form dissolved into the night, leaving me alone with a truth I didn't want to carry. I slept terribly, if I slept at all. The storm had passed, but my mind had not. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that disc lifting inch by inch, revealing a pale claw or a crooked smile emerging from the darkness. More than once I jolted upright, convinced something was lurking at the foot of my bed. The dim morning light creeping through my curtains offered no comfort. If anything, it made reality sharper, harsher. My hands shook as I dressed. My thoughts raced. And beneath all that panic was a single, gnawing question. What had Pickman become? He painted monsters with the intimacy of a man sketching his own reflection. His features had changed over the last year, subtle at first, sharper lines around the jaw, a slumping posture, an odd sheen in his eyes. Reed had noticed it. Others had hinted at it. I had dismissed it. Now I wondered whether Pickman's familiarity with the creatures had gone deeper than art, whether he had become something between worlds, a mediator, a bridge, or worse, a student learning from his subjects. As I tried to calm my pulse, I reached for my coat, and that was when I felt the paper. My breath hitched. Slowly, with trembling fingers, I pulled it from the pocket. It was the photograph, the very same one I had seen, pinned to the abominable canvas. Except now it was clearer, the details even more grotesquely sharp. Had I simply not noticed before? Or had the lamplight distorted it? The creature's posture was unmistakable. The crouch, the claws, the unnatural bend of its limbs. But something else chilled me more. Its eyes. They were fixed on something in the foreground that wasn't visible in the photo. Something just outside the frame. Or someone. The angle of the gaze, the tension in its shoulders, the anticipation in its posture. None of that had been clear last night. But now, the implication was unmistakable. It had been looking at the photographer. At Pickman, my stomach twisted. The image felt like a captured moment of negotiation or recognition. I imagined Pickman standing just out of frame, his camera shaking in his hands while the creature waited for him to finish. And the way its muscles coiled in the image made me wonder whether it had agreed to stand still, or whether Pickman had interrupted it feeding. A sudden dread filled me that went far beyond fear. That photograph was not a study. It was a witness. Something else slid from the pocket when I shook the coat. A thumbnail-sized scrap of paper, brittle with age. I bent to pick it up. On it was a sketch rough, faint, but enough to identify the subject. A face, Pickman's, but twisted, altered, halfway dissolved into the features of one of the creatures, not fully monstrous, not fully human. A transition frozen on paper like a warning, or a prophecy. I staggered back, clutching the coat as if it might burn me. The walls of my room seemed suddenly too close, as though they were pressing inward, trying to hear my breathing. A tremor ran through me. Pickman hadn't merely observed the creatures. He had become connected to them, perhaps even chosen by them. And last night something beneath that well had recognized me too. I couldn't stay indoors. I needed air. I needed distance. I needed clarity. But every corner of the city felt infected by what I now knew. Every alley seemed to hide a dark mouth leading downward. Every cellar window reminded me of the one in Pickman's studio. Every rumble of the trolley felt like something crawling beneath the pavement. Worst of all was the sinking realization that I could never go back to the art club, or to my old life, or to any place that felt clean and ordinary. Something had fractured permanently inside me, and the crack grew wider with every breath. I kept picturing the moment the wooden disc shifted, those eyes glinting up at us, that hiss of recognition. Pickman had been right. I could never forget, and the worst part wasn't the terror beneath Boston. The worst part was the knowledge that Pickman was walking straight toward his doom, and that whatever waited in the tunnels had no intention of letting him walk away again. For days after that night in the North End, the world became a distorted echo of itself. I walked through familiar streets as though they were pale memories, thin, fragile, incapable of offering comfort. Every sound felt amplified, the hollow clatter of carriage wheels, the hushed footsteps in alleyways, the distant hum of the trolley. Even the city's daylight seemed different, brighter in the wrong places and too dim in the others, as though the sun itself was wary of shining too deeply on Boston's hidden layers. I could not bring myself to enter a cellar. Even the sight of a basement door made my skin tighten, as though cold breath were blowing from beneath it. And the subway? The subway was absolutely out of the question. The idea of descending into a tunnel beneath the earth, those dark chambers that stretched for miles, sent a sharp, nauseating tremor through me. After what I had seen beneath Pickman's studio, the underground no longer felt like a marvel of engineering, but a thin crust laid over something ancient and hungry. I avoided shadows when I could, but in a city as old and patched together as Boston, they are everywhere, lingering in the cracks between tenements, curled beneath stairwells, clinging to the undersides of bridges. More than once I thought I saw something move in them, something small and quick and too low to the ground. Rats, I told myself, just rats. Yet the memory of that scraping beneath the well cover insisted otherwise. What made everything worse was the silence. Pickman had vanished. No note, no word, no sightings from neighbors or landlords. It was as though he had dissolved into the damp brickwork of the North End, and the city swallowed him whole. At first, I assumed he was simply hiding. Pickman was secretive by nature, always slipping through alleyways as though walking a private map no one else could see. But days became a week, and then two, and not even the art club, who had once tolerated him out of sheer admiration, had heard anything. Reed sent letters. Mino called at his apartment. Bosworth made a small scene at the club, furious that Pickman had abandoned a commission. But nothing came of their inquiries. It was as though Richard Upton Pickman had never existed. I told myself not to care. I told myself I should be glad he was gone, that if he had any sense, he would flee as far from the creatures beneath Boston as he could. But something inside me whispered another possibility. Perhaps he hadn't fled at all. Perhaps they had taken him. The idea lingered like a poisonous fog, clouding every thought. I returned to Pickman's last words to me. "They know you now." Was it a warning? A farewell? A confession? One morning, driven by a restless dread I could neither explain nor ignore, I found myself walking toward the art club. The building loomed with its polished stone facade and wide, decorative windows, a place dedicated to creativity and comfort, utterly untouched by the horrors I now carried inside me. As soon as I stepped inside, however, I felt the difference. Conversations halted. People watched me with subtle curiosity, some with concern. Reed approached, his spectacles askew, a frown carved deep into his brow. "You look terrible," he said with a bluntness only Reed could muster. "Have you been ill?" "In a manner of speaking," I answered. "Has anyone heard from Pickman?" That question darkened Reed's expression instantly. "No, and frankly, I don't expect to." The man was losing himself. His features were changing. His temperament was unstable. Reed leaned in slightly. "I told you long ago, something was wrong with him. Something in his blood." Those words struck me harder than I expected. Reed didn't know the half of it, and yet his intuition had brushed dangerously close to the truth. I left the club soon after, unable to bear the weight of their suspicion, their whispers, their questions. I walked aimlessly through the city, avoiding every downward step, every shadowed corner. Each turn led me deeper into my own thoughts, and each thought circled back to the same point, the photograph. I had hidden it deep in a drawer, wrapped in cloth as though covering it might contain its power. But even concealed, I felt it like a pulse beneath the floorboards of my apartment, the silent watcher I could not forget. By nightfall, the unease had grown unbearable. I returned home, bolted the door, lit every lamp, and despite every instinct telling me not to, I retrieved the photograph. The creature stared back at me. The clarity of the image felt sharper now, as though the passage of days had not dulled its realism but sharpened it, refusing to fade into imagination. The creature's eyes, reflective and calculating, seemed aware. This was no animal captured unawares. It had posed. It had allowed itself to be seen. Had it allowed Pickman to live? My hands trembled as I traced the border of the photograph. For a moment, I considered burning it, destroying everything that tied me to that night. But something stopped me. A fragment of curiosity, or perhaps fear of erasing proof that the world beneath Boston was real. As I stared at the photo, I noticed something I hadn't before. In the extreme corner of the frame, barely visible, was a shadow. Not the creature's, not a part of the tunnel. A human shadow, long and angular. Pickman's shadow. He had stood closer than I imagined, and the creature had leaned toward him slightly, its posture less threatening and more familiar. A terrible thought struck me. What if Pickman hadn't simply studied them? What if they had accepted him? The sketches in my coat pocket suddenly made sense. The subtle distortions in his face, his quiet laughter when asked about inspiration, his uncanny ease in the cellars, his knowledge of tunnels older than the city. What if he had been changing long before I met him? A sudden knock at my door jarred me from the spiraling thoughts. I froze, the photograph slipping from my fingers and fluttering to the floor. The knock came again, soft, almost tentative. The hairs on my neck rose. No one visited me at this hour. No one knew where I lived except a few friends, and none of them would knock like that. Slow, cautious, almost curious. My pulse hammered. For a long moment, neither I nor the visitor moved. Then, as though realizing I would not answer, the knock ceased. Silence filled the building like smoke. I waited, breath held painfully, listening for footsteps, for movement, for anything. Nothing. And yet, long after the knocking stopped, I felt watched, deeply watched. The same feeling I'd had in the cellar, when the wooden disc shifted and those eyes gleamed upward from the dark. I closed the curtains, locked the door again, sat in the middle of the room with every lamp burning until dawn bled into the sky. But even daylight could not erase the truth that had settled like frost in my bones. Pickman was gone, and something beneath the city knew my name. Several days passed before I gathered the courage to step outside after dusk, and even then, it was not courage in the true sense. It was restlessness, a gnawing unease that fed on silence and solitude until the walls of my apartment felt more confining than any alleyway in the North End. Despite all logic, a part of me believed that answers awaited somewhere in those twisting streets. Answers that might explain Pickman's disappearance or dispel the dread that had settled permanently behind my ribs. And so, one evening as the city lights flickered to life, trembling in the mist like watchful eyes, I found myself walking toward the North End district again. Every footstep felt wrong, as though I were moving against the very grain of sanity. Yet I could not stop. The shadows there held truth, terrible truth, but truth nonetheless, and I could no longer bear the weight of not knowing. The deeper I ventured, the narrower the streets became. Old brick buildings leaned over me like ancient sentinels, their crooked chimneys jutting into the fog-heavy air. The smells of damp stone and fish markets lingered everywhere. A sense of uncanny familiarity washed over me, as though the city itself remembered my steps from the night I followed Pickman, but the path refused to remain the same. I turned down an alley that seemed right, only to reach a dead end I did not remember. Retraced my steps, tried another, the same result. The angles, the distances, the shapes of the doorways, all had shifted, subtly but unmistakably, like pieces in a nightmare that rearranged themselves when unobserved. The city was hiding something, or guiding me away. The realization hit with an icy clarity. I could no longer find the studio. The route Pickman led me through, those twisting alleys and buried lanes, was it really a path? Or had he moved with knowledge not accessible to ordinary men? The thought that Pickman navigated the North End, not physically but intuitively, like a creature returning to its burrow, sent an unpleasant shiver through me. I pressed on, stubbornly determined. Night thickened, lamps flickered. A few passers-by watched me with wary eyes, as though sensing that I was trespassing on ground not meant for outsiders. Hours passed. The mist thinned, revealing the moon as a pale sliver through a veil of cloud. Near midnight, exhaustion pushed me to pause beneath an overhanging eave beside a sagging warehouse. That was when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, not from the street. From beneath the street, my blood froze. The tapping came again, steady, deliberate, far too measured to be coincidence. It reverberated through the stones like a coded message. Something was moving in the tunnels below, keeping pace with my steps. Awareness of my presence. Recognition. Not rats. Never rats. And then, from the shadows behind me, a voice cut through the silence. "You're looking for him." I spun instinctively, my heart leaping to my throat. A man stood several yards back, half concealed by the gloom. His coat was tattered, his features gaunt, his eyes bright with the wary sharpness of a street dweller accustomed to surviving on instinct alone. "Pickman," I said before I could stop myself. "You knew him?" Something in his expression tightened. Everyone who's lived here long enough knows the name. Some whisper it, some curse it, but all of us have heard it. He stepped forward slowly, as though approaching a frightened animal. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he warned. "Not when the air feels like this." "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me already suspected. He gestured toward the stones beneath our feet. "The ground's talking tonight. It only does that when they're restless." The tapping sound came again, closer now. My stomach twisted painfully. "You know about them?" The man hesitated, then nodded once. "We all do. The tunnels run under the whole district. Some places are worse than others. Some nights are worse than others." His eyes drifted to me with newfound scrutiny. "You've been near them recently. I can tell." I felt my breath catch. "How?" "Because they remember." He pointed to the pavement. "Footsteps, voices, scents. They remember. And they don't forget strangers who've been too close." My pulse hammered. "Do you know where Pickman is?" At the name, the man's gaze darkened. "Some say he went down to where they live. Down past the brickwork. Down past the old wells." His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. "Some say he never came back up." The tapping grew into a scraping soft, but unmistakably real. The street dweller stiffened. "They're listening," he whispered urgently. "Go home. Before they decide, they want another look at you." He turned and vanished into a doorway so quickly I might have imagined him, but the scraping beneath the street continued, growing louder, more confident, as though emboldened by my presence. My hands shook as I backed away, step by step, from the alley's deepest shadows. The city felt alive, breathing, pulsing, watching, and I knew then, as surely as the moon hung above me, that returning to the North End had been a mistake, a terrible, unforgivable mistake. I quickened my pace. The scraping followed, more faint, but present nonetheless. As I reached the main street, the lamps blazed brighter, the noise of the city returning like a protective skin around me. Only when I reached a crowded avenue did the sound finally stop. I walked home in a half-daze, nearly stumbling in my haste to reach the false security of my building. As soon as I shut the door behind me, I leaned against it, breathless, my heart racing. Pickman was gone. The studio was unreachable. The alleys had rearranged themselves. The tunnels remembered me. I wanted desperately to dismiss the encounter as nonsense, the words of a madman. But the scraping had been real. The way the ground vibrated beneath my feet had been real, and the terror that clung to the street dweller's voice, raw, instinctive, and ancient, had been too genuine to doubt. Somewhere beneath Boston, something was awake, and now it knew where to find me. I sank into a chair, my hands covering my face. I wanted, for a fleeting moment, to forget everything, to burn the photograph, to scrub Pickman's memory from my mind. But the truth was impossible to outrun, because in the stillness of my room, long after the city outside had quieted, I heard it again, faint, measured, rhythmic, something tapping from beneath my floorboards. That night, sleep was impossible. Not that I expected any. Even before I'd taken off my coat or drawn the curtains tight against the street, I knew rest would not come. Something had followed me, not in the physical sense, perhaps, but in spirit, in memory, in the way a shadow clings to a man long after he has stepped out of the light. The tapping beneath my floorboards had been faint but unmistakable. It was a confirmation of every dread I had tried to suppress, the echo of something vast and unseen, quietly testing the boundaries between its world and mine. I paced the room for what felt like hours, each step accompanied by the subtle creak of the old floorboards, no doubt the same creak I had heard countless times before without noticing. But tonight, each sound felt like a message, a warning, a reminder that safety was a fiction I had long since lost the right to believe in. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to sit. My hands trembled as I lit a lamp, its warm glow painting trembling halos across the walls. Shadows pooled in the corners as though unwilling to retreat fully. My thoughts spiraled back to Pickman, to the way he had moved through the North End alleys without hesitation, to the unnerving familiarity he had shown toward those ancient tunnels. Had he known they would follow me? Had he known the creatures beneath that rotting studio never forget their visitors? My mind circled these questions like vultures around a carcass, each answer darker than the last. For a moment, I tried to ground myself in logic, to remind myself that my room was safe, that I was above ground, that the floorboards had no gaps wide enough for anything larger than a mouse. But reason is fragile. It holds strong only in the absence of memory, and I remembered too much. I remembered the well cover trembling beneath unseen pressure. I remembered the hiss rising from the depths like steam from a fissure in the earth's crust. I remembered those reflective eyes gleaming upward with unmistakable recognition. As the night deepened, the tapping quieted. But quiet did not comfort me. In fact, it unsettled me more. Silence meant movement, silent movement. It meant the creature beneath the streets was no longer probing but listening, learning, perhaps circling beneath the foundation of the building, searching for a point of entry. My thoughts spun into places they should not go. I imagined it beneath me now, moving through the earth like a serpent, its claws scraping through soil, its slumped canine form navigating forgotten burrows with practiced ease. Perhaps it was sniffing the stone, remembering my scent, arranging the darkness around it as it prepared to climb. I rose abruptly and moved to my window. The street outside was empty, slick with rain. Gas lamps flickered weakly against the mist, casting elongated shadows across the cobblestones. The city seemed tranquil, eerily so, but I knew better. There were depths beneath that calm, depths no lamplight could reach. A part of me considered leaving the city, entirely fleeing somewhere bright, somewhere far from Boston's ancient foundations. But what good would distance do? Could I run from something that navigated darkness like a seasoned hunter? Something that remembered my footsteps and my voice? Something that had watched civilized men for centuries, waiting patiently as they built their homes on top of its realm? I feared the answer. My eyes drifted to the drawer where I had hidden the photograph again. The mere thought of the image made my stomach twist, but I could not resist. I needed to see it once more, needed to confirm that my imagination had not exaggerated its terror. Slowly, I crossed the room and opened the drawer. There it lay still, wrapped in cloth, but the cloth seemed damp, as though touched by something cold. I swallowed hard and unwrapped the photograph. The creature's expression was unchanged, ravenous, calculating, alive. But something else caught my attention. Near the lower corner of the image, just where shadow converged, was a faint, barely visible shape, a silhouette. Had it always been there? Or had the lamplight been too dim to reveal it before? The outline resembled a hand, not the creature's, a human hand, Pickman's hand. The angle of the shadow suggested he was closer to the monster than any sane man would dare. The fingers were curled slightly, not in fear, but almost in greeting. My skin crawled. This was no predator captured mid-attack. This was an encounter, a meeting, opposed cooperation between artist and subject. The creature had not threatened. Pickman had acknowledged him, accepted him. Had he accepted it in return? My heart thudded with the weight of a possibility that now felt impossible to ignore. What if Pickman hadn't been prey? What if he had been one of them? I pressed the photograph face down onto the table, unwilling to look at it further. My breath came shallow and fast. Around me, the shadows seemed to pulse gently, as though responding to my panic. I tried to steady myself, gripping the edge of the table, forcing air into my lungs. But then, a soft sound drifted through the room, not tapping, not scraping, breathing, faint, slow, deliberate breathing, rising from somewhere beneath the floorboards. Not enough to distinguish shape, but enough to convey intention, enough to tell me it was waiting. I staggered back, knocking into a chair. The lamp flickered violently, casting spasms of light across the walls. I reached for the nearest thing that resembled a weapon, a heavy brass candlestick, and held it before me with trembling hands. For a long moment, the breathing continued. Inhale, pause, exhale. Each cycle seemed to vibrate through the frame of the building, calling to mind something immense crouched just below, its chest rising and falling in time with mine. Then, as abruptly as it began, the breathing stopped. The floorboards grew still. The room settled into a silence so absolute it seemed to swallow every trace of warmth. Even the lamps felt dimmer, as though something had brushed past them, leeching their light. My heart hammered in my chest, my thoughts racing. I backed toward my bedroom door, desperate for distance, even though I knew no part of the apartment offered true safety. I locked the door, though I knew wood and metal could do little against anything capable of shifting a well cover from below. I pressed my back against the far wall and sank slowly to the floor. Hours passed. The city grew quiet. My eyes remained open, and in that sleepless stillness, I realized a truth more terrifying than any sound I had heard. The creatures beneath Boston did not need to break through my floor. They had found a way into my mind. And once something enters the mind, there is no locking it out. In the sleepless quiet of the next day, as pale winter light crept across my floorboards like a timid intruder, a strange clarity settled over me. It wasn't calm. Nothing resembling calm had touched my mind since the night in the North End, but it was a kind of focus, sharp and cold, like the mind of a man stepping onto a ledge. I could no longer ignore the memories I had tried to bury. They rose now, unbidden, arranging themselves into an order I had not seen before. Most of them were conversations with Pickman offhand remarks, cryptic musings, rambling monologues about history and ghosts. At the time, I had taken them as eccentricities, harmless theatrics of a man too immersed in his art. Now, replaying them, I realized they had been warnings. Warnings I had failed to understand. The one that returned most vividly was from a night nearly a year before, long before he took me down to the cellar, long before I knew what waited beneath the city. We'd been walking home after an art club meeting. Rain had just begun to fall, and the city lights shimmered across the slick pavement like dying stars. Pickman had been unusually quiet that night, his eyes lingering too long on the alleyways we passed. Suddenly, he had said, "You know, there are places in this city that weren't built, they grew." At the time, I had laughed, assuming it was metaphor. "Streets don't grow, Pickman." He'd given a faint, humorless smile. "Some of them do. Or at least, they follow old paths. Paths older than churches, older than houses, older than graves. Boston sits on memory. It forgets nothing, no matter how many layers of brick we lay over it." I had teased him then, asking whether the cobblestones whispered their secrets to him in the night. He had not laughed. Instead, he'd stopped walking, turned, and looked at me with an intensity I had not understood until now. "There are tunnels beneath the North End that no map has ever recorded," he said softly. "They were dug before the English arrived. before the Dutch built their first posts, maybe even before the natives told their oldest stories. They lead to places where daylight has never reached, places where the earth's first noises still echo. I remember brushing it aside, telling him he read too many legends. But he had continued, each word weighted with a quiet urgency. People talk about Salem witches, he said, but Salem wasn't the only place touched by strange things. This whole region was thick with fear long before the first trials. The settlers didn't invent superstition, they inherited it. He had paused beneath a lamppost, the rain pattering gently against his coat. My family knew things, old things, things that might seem insane now. But in the 17th century, Boston was a place where darkness walked freely. People whispered about creatures digging under the hills. They said the earth sometimes opened to swallow the wicked. At the time, I had felt a fleeting, amused chill. Now, that chill returned with far greater force. I thought also of a moment in his studio weeks later, when he had been sketching the outline of a creature, a long-limbed, canine-faced thing, crouched low on its haunches. I'd asked him where he conceived of such anatomy. He had glanced at me, eyes bright with something like reverence. Nature repeats itself, he'd said, even in places where sunlight never goes, even in shapes that were never meant to be seen. Then he added, almost casually, some forms evolve in darkness, others devolve into it. At the time, I assumed he was speaking about artistic instinct. Now I knew better. He had been speaking about lineage. Something else surfaced next, something I had nearly forgotten. It was the story he told me about his ancestor, the one hanged in Salem in 1692. Most artists bring up ancestral history as a brag or a joke, but Pickman had spoken of her with a quiet, unsettling pride. Her name was Abigail, he had said. They accused her of consorting with things in the night, but she never confessed. She died with her secrets intact. I had joked that perhaps artistic talent ran in the blood. He hadn't smiled. The Martenses had their curse, he murmured. My family had its visions. That name, Martens, meant nothing to me then. Only later, when I learned fragments of old New England lore, did I realize he referred not to Salem, but to the old tales of a degenerated family in the Catskills stories Lovecraft himself once collected. Pickman had woven legends together like threads in a tapestry, one I was only now beginning to see. And then came the memory that shook me hardest. It was something he said on the very night he invited me to the North End. You have to paint from life, he told me, as we walked into the dark maze of alleys. Otherwise, the result is dead. But if you look closely, really closely, you'd be surprised how much of the living world is hidden in the dead places. Dead places? I asked. He gestured vaguely toward the labyrinth before us. Cellars, old houses, forgotten wells, places built on top of older places. The ground remembers everything buried in it. Only now did I see the implications of his words. Pickman had not discovered the creatures recently. He had known of them for years. He had studied them, documented them, perhaps even spoken with them. He had never said as much, but his silences meant everything. I sat in my room, replaying each memory, until the lines between past and present blurred like ink in water. Pickman's hints, his warnings, his obsession with the North End's forgotten architecture, they were not abstract musings. They were the words of a man living in two worlds at once, a man growing more comfortable in the shadows than in daylight. And then another memory surfaced, one small, almost trivial at the time, but now catastrophic. The night I walked into his studio, before we ever descended into the cellar, he had said, "Keep close to me. The alleys in this district don't stay still. They shift, because the things beneath them shift." I had taken it for dramatic exaggeration. Now I recalled the difficulty I had finding the studio again, the way streets twisted into new paths. Dead ends appeared where none existed, and certain corners felt alive beneath my feet. Pickman had not exaggerated. He had merely described a truth I refused to see. The tunnels below shaped the streets above. Creatures moved beneath the city, altering the old foundations, pushing soil, collapsing or forming paths, raising mounds and hollowing pockets beneath buildings. And perhaps, just perhaps, they guided the living, subtly turning paths aside, preventing intruders from finding their way back to forbidden places. It was no wonder I could not find the studio again. The city was protecting them, or worse, they were protecting themselves. I pressed my palms to my face, my breath harsh and uneven. Pickman's disappearance suddenly made perfect sense. He had returned to the only place that felt like home. He had gone beneath the earth, into the tunnels, into their world. And I knew, even before my mind formed the words, that he was not coming back. Not as a man. The tapping beneath my floorboards had begun again, soft, rhythmic, like something remembering the cadence of my footsteps. And with each tap, I understood a little more of the truth Pickman had devoted his life to. Art is memory. Memory is hunger, and some hungers live longer than the world built above them. The night I finally retraced Pickman's path with clarity, the only night it revealed itself without twisting apart like a dream, I realized something dreadful. I had not been lost before. The alleys had not shifted arbitrarily. They had been hiding from me. But tonight, as though sensing a resolve too heavy to divert, the city opened itself like a wound. It began with a decision I still cannot justify. I told myself it was necessity, that to rid myself of the tapping beneath my floor, the breathing in the shadows, the sensation of being watched through layers of stone, I had to confront the path that started everything. I had to see the studio again, even if it emptied me of whatever sanity remained. So, I left my apartment long after midnight, when the lamps burned low and the fog trudged heavily through the streets like an exhausted animal. I avoided the subway instinctively. The very thought of descending into its tunnels made my skin crawl. Instead, I walked toward South Station, where the elevated cars rattled above the city like skeletal ghosts. The station was nearly empty. A single tired conductor nodded absently as I boarded the last shuttle. The car swayed and groaned, its old frame echoing faintly with every gust of wind that scraped along its sides. I stood rather than sat, gripping the railing and listening, not to the creak of metal, but to the darkness beneath the tracks. Every time the train crossed a deep seam of the city, I swore I felt it, the faintest shudder rising up through the supports, as though the ground below were not solid but a vast, breathing organism. Once, I thought I saw movement in the darkness beneath the rails, a ripple, like shifting earth, but the train lurched forward before I could confirm. When I finally stepped off at Battery Street, the station was utterly deserted. The lamps flickered with a sickly yellow glow, illuminating the wet pavement and little else. Boston's modernity stopped abruptly here. The old waterfront stretched ahead, its ancient warehouses looming like fossilized beasts. The fog clung thicker, rolling off the harbor in heavy drifts. As I walked along Constitution Wharf, the world felt increasingly wrong. The cobblestones were uneven, slick with moisture, as though countless centuries of storms had worn them into unnatural shapes. Every corner of the district radiated an age I had never noticed before. Slumps in the ground where old houses once stood, doorways sealed with mismatched bricks, windows crooked as though sagging under the weight of memories too heavy to bear. When Pickman and I had walked this route the first time, I had been too focused on keeping up with his long strides and avoiding the smell of fish rot to notice the details. Now, alone, each detail pressed on me like a hand. At one point, I passed a churchyard I did not remember, its wrought iron gate bent like twisted ribs. A faint breeze stirred the dead leaves inside, carrying the scent of old stone and older secrets. I hurried past, refusing to let my imagination attach forms to the shadows between the headstones. Then it began, the narrowing. The street tightened into a crooked alleyway, the buildings leaning inward like conspirators murmuring over me. The fog slithered across the ground, gathering in pockets where light did not reach. The tops of the houses vanished into darkness, their chimneys hanging like broken teeth against the faint glow of the moon. I knew this alley. Despite its shifting shape, its impossible geometry, this was the path Pickman had taken. My heartbeat quickened. Each step felt like treading deeper into a memory I had tried desperately to forget. The air grew colder, carrying the faint scent of mildew and ancient dust. Somewhere far off, I thought I heard the hollow drip of water, slow, rhythmic, like blood falling from a cracked roof. The alley bent sharply left, then right. The turns came too quickly, too unnaturally, but I did not hesitate. Something in me knew that hesitation meant losing the path entirely. Then, suddenly, it opened into a wider passage, a tangle of gables and overhanging roofs, some sagging under centuries of decay. Their windows were small, paned with crooked glass that looked more like cataracts than windows. Some houses leaned forward at such angles it seemed impossible they still stood. Pickman's voice echoed in my memory. "Back Bay isn't Boston. This is Boston." I now understood. This was the skeleton of the city, the part that remembered everything buried beneath it. The alley dipped downward, the air thickened, and then, looming out of the darkness, I saw it. The door, ancient, worm-eaten, its panels carved with patterns no craftsman of modern times would ever produce. It let out an almost defeated sigh as the wind pushed against it. My pulse quickened. No directions from Pickman, no guiding lamp, no reassuring, mad grin, only me, and the door that should not be found by any sane man twice. As I approached, the fog thinned, revealing the small details I had missed before. Faint scratches near the bottom of the doorframe, the wood worn smooth, as though something had pushed against it repeatedly. A lock that looked new, too new, as though replaced often, and above it all, a smell rising from the crack's damp stone, oil, and something faintly metallic. I reached for the handle. It was cold, colder than the night air. For a moment, doubt pierced me. What was I doing? Why had I come back? If Pickman had vanished into these depths, what chance did I have of emerging again? Then, from deep within the house, somewhere beyond the walls, I heard a sound, a faint scuffling, slow, deliberate, alive. Something waited, not in the cellar yet, not beneath the well, but in the walls of the house itself. My grip tightened on the handle. Every instinct screamed to run, but another force, a darker force, pushed me forward. The need to understand, the need to know whether Pickman had truly crossed the threshold between man and monster. With a slow breath, I turned the handle. The door creaked inward. A draft of cold air brushed against my face, carrying the unmistakable scent of the cellar below. It reached me like the breath of something ancient, something that had waited too long to be disturbed. The darkness beyond the door pulsed like a heartbeat. I stepped inside, and the house closed behind me. The door closed behind me with a softness that felt unnatural, as though the wood itself wanted to trap me inside. The faintest click echoed through the narrow hallway, not loud, but final, an exhale of the house claiming another trespasser. The darkness inside was thicker than the fog outside, the kind of darkness that seems to coat the skin rather than simply obscure sight. I fumbled for the small lamp I had brought, its weak flame shuddering as though recoiling from what lay ahead. The wood-paneled walls were warped with age, damp in places, and inscribed with faint stains that resembled, though I dared not dwell on the thought, finger marks dragging downward. The air smelled of oil, mildew, and something metallic, like rust or blood diluted by time. As the lamp's glow flickered, the shadows clung stubbornly to corners and doorways, refusing to retreat fully. Ahead of me was the room where Pickman had once told me to make myself at home, though no one with a sane mind could feel at home here. I stepped through the doorway, and the lamp illuminated the space like a reluctant confession. Pickman's paintings still hung on the walls. I had told myself countless times that memory had exaggerated their grotesquerie, that no artist, no matter how morbid, could capture terror so vividly. But the moment the light touched the first canvas, my breath caught in my throat, and a chill raced down my spine. The images were exactly as I remembered them, yet worse, as if time had allowed them to ripen into something more vivid, more aware. The first showed a narrow burial ground beneath a sky the color of a dying bruise. Bent, slouched, figures too long of limb, too slack, of flesh crept between headstones. Their faces were not fully formed but hinted at expressions that made my stomach twist. Hunger, cunning, anticipation. Each brushstroke suggested motion so subtly that if I looked away, I feared they would shift positions. Another painting depicted a dim cellar tunnel, brick walls slick with moisture. In the foreground, a creature crouched over something, someone. The details blurred where the subject lay, but the impression was unmistakable. And the creature's face, those hollow eyes, seemed to glint in the lamplight, reflecting something beyond pigment. My heart thudded painfully as I forced myself to keep moving. There was no turning back now. Some part of me understood that retreat would only feed whatever waited below. Pickman had always said that art required an intimacy with truth, but standing in that room, surrounded by canvases that seemed almost to breathe, I realized he had not found truth. He had unearthed it, dug it up from depths no man should ever approach. The monstrous precision of his strokes suggested observation, not imagination. These were portraits, not fantasies. And then I saw it, the painting he had once unveiled for me, with a proud, unsettling flourish. The lesson: a circle of dog-like creatures huddled beneath a dead tree, teaching a small child human, terrified, yet disturbingly transfixed, to gnaw at an unidentifiable carcass. The child's face bore a tragic mixture of fear and mimicry, as though torn between instinct and humanity. A faint chill slithered down my spine. I had thought this painting grotesque enough months ago, but now, with the memory of the tapping beneath my floors and the breathing in my walls, I felt something new, a sickening awareness of inevitability. The painting spoke of transformation, of lineage, of something being passed on, something ancient, something remembered. I forced my gaze away, only to find myself before a new canvas, one I had never seen. This one was larger, almost floor to ceiling. It portrayed a cross-section of a hill, Beacon Hill, unmistakably hollowed beneath the foundations, like an ant farm. Strange, slumped figures crawled through the tunnels, moving with a disturbing grace that made their malformed bodies seem deceptively agile. Above them, oblivious citizens strolled down lamplit streets, unaware of the labyrinth beneath their feet. But it wasn't the figures in the tunnels that made my throat tighten. It was the placement of one tunnel lower, narrower, directly beneath a small boarding house. My boarding house, and in the tunnel beneath, a creature crouched, its face turned upward, its hollow eyes fixed on the faint silhouette of a man, me sleeping above. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the lamp. A wave of nausea surged through me. Pickman had painted this long before I ever heard the tapping from beneath my floorboards, long before I knew to fear it. Had he foreseen it? Or worse, had he led them? The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls tightening, the shadows gathering into shapes that seemed to lean closer. I stumbled backward, bumping into a table cluttered with empty frames and brushes snapped in half. My lamp wavered, its flame shrinking. "No," I whispered, though I didn't know what I was refusing. My memories, the truth, the paintings themselves, perhaps all three. A faint creak sounded from the floorboards beneath my feet. Not the house settling, not the groan of old wood. This was purposeful, inquisitive. It came again, a soft, expanded breath beneath the planks, as though something below had sensed my presence and was rising to greet it. Panic clawed through me. I backed away from the sound, moving toward the doorway that led deeper into the house, to the stairs that descended toward the cellar. A memory surfaced sharply. Pickman's voice, low and half mad with excitement. "You'll see things down there that make sense of everything above." At the time, I'd assumed he meant artistic inspiration. But now I knew he had meant it literally. Everything in the studio, the paintings, the brushes, The canvases, stretched taut as skin, was arranged like a prelude, a warning, or perhaps an invitation. The air grew colder. The smell of oil paint gave way to something danker, earthier. A draft slipped from beneath a door further down the hallway, carrying with it a scent unmistakable and horrifyingly familiar. The smell of the old brick well. The cellar. My breath hitched. I should have fled. Every part of me screamed to run, to escape the house, the district, the city itself. Yet something dragged me forward, not physically, but with a gravitational pull of dread and curiosity. The same force that had drawn Pickman downward. The same force that had taken him from the surface world entirely. I approached the door leading to the cellar stairs. My hand trembled as it touched the knob. Behind me, the paintings watched with eyes that had never belonged to brushstrokes. Ahead of me, the darkness of the stairwell yawned open, its breath cold and humid. And beneath that darkness, deeper still, something moved, slow, patient, hungry. Pickman had walked these steps before, and now I was following. Whether to find him or to join him, I no longer knew. The door to the cellar opened with a low moan, as though exhaling centuries of stale breath. A draft flowed upward, damp, metallic, tinged with the faint musk of deep earth, and it chilled my skin before I had even stepped through. My lamp guttered violently, as if the flame itself recoiled from the threshold. Still, I gripped it tightly and began my descent. Each step groaned beneath me. The wooden staircase felt older than the house above, as though it belonged to a structure long buried, long forgotten. Darkness pressed in around me, thick and intimate, whispering in the crevices of my mind. By the time my foot reached the stone floor, the world above felt impossibly distant, like a fading memory. I lifted the lamp higher. The cellar unfolded before me exactly as I remembered, and yet more dreadful for that very familiarity. Its walls were rough brick, some crumbling, some slick with moisture that glistened under the trembling flame. Pipes ran overhead like ribs of some great fossilized beast, but my gaze was drawn not to the walls, nor the scattered canvases leaning against them. It was the well. A circular brick structure rose from the dirt floor, its rim barely 4 or 5 inches above the ground. Moss clung to its edges in dark streaks. The wood cover, a thick disc warped with age, rested atop it, though not flush. It was slightly askew, as though recently disturbed, as though something beneath had pushed upward. My breath snagged in my throat. The cellar seemed to hold its breath with me. Pickman's voice echoed in my mind. One of the old wells. They go deeper than anyone knows. He had said it with excitement, not fear. At the time, I had mistaken his tone for the eccentric pride of a man who enjoyed dwelling among relics. Now, I understood. The well was not a relic. It was an entrance. Something brushed lightly against the underside of the wood. I froze. The lamp's flame trembled. A faint vibration rippled across the dirt floor, subtle but unmistakable. For an instant, I thought I felt breath cold, damp rise from the gaps along the well's rim. I forced myself to look away, toward the studio space carved out on the far side of the cellar. Pickman had furnished it with a strange mix of normalcy and madness. A sturdy table crowded with brushes stained in unnatural hues, an easel standing like a skeletal sentinel, a scattering of sketches littering the floor in curling stacks. Even the gaslight fixtures he had once used remained, though dark now, as though extinguished by something more deliberate than neglect. I approached the easel. The unfinished canvas upon it was too large, almost monstrous in scale, even half-formed. Its imagery struck me with the force of a blow. The creature upon it was hunched, crouched low, its claws sunk into something unrecognizable. Its face, canine yet human, yet neither, leaned toward its prey with an expression that transcended hunger. It was recognition. It was delight. My stomach turned. This was no study of imagination. This was observation. But then I noticed something else. A thumbtack on the upper corner of the canvas, securing a piece of paper. The paper was curled at its edges, stained with moisture, but through its warped surface, I could see faint shapes, a corner of stone, the outline of the cellar wall, and a shadow, a monstrous shadow. Pickman had painted from photographs, and he had not used staged models. This was a photograph from life. My fingers trembled as I reached for it. Just as the paper began to uncurl, a sudden noise shattered the silence. A soft but unmistakable scurrying across the far side of the cellar. My head jerked up, heart pounding. No rats made sounds like that. It was too heavy, too deliberate, too aware. The sound was followed by a low scrape, like claws dragging lightly across stone. I stepped back, nearly knocking over a jar of murky paint water. My lamp quaked in my hand, casting violent, jittering shadows across the walls. "Who's there?" I whispered before I could stop myself. Silence. A silence so deep it seemed to swallow the very question. Then another scrape, this time closer, as though something crawled along the underside of the floor, hugging the earth, circling just outside the edge of the lamplight. My skin prickled with a primal dread. I backed toward the center of the cellar, my eyes flicking to every corner where a shadow seemed too thick. And then it came again, the faint, rhythmic tapping from beneath the well cover, not loud, not frantic, a patient, knowing sound. Tap, 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 as though beckoning. My breath came shallow and uneven. I could feel sweat trickle down my back despite the cold. The tapping grew louder, or perhaps closer. The wood cover shifted ever so slightly. Dust drifted from its edges, dancing in the lamplight like falling ash. My mind screamed to flee, but my legs refused to obey. I stared at the well as though hypnotized. A subtle pressure built in the air, a sense that something below was rising, drawing nearer, sensing my presence. The shadows around the cellar quivered, pulling inward, drawn toward the well like iron filings to a magnet. Suddenly, a sharp metallic clatter jolted me from my paralysis. Behind me, I spun, raising the lamp high. The large camera Pickman had used, the one he bragged about, now lay toppled on its side, as though shoved by an unseen hand. Its glass plate had shattered across the ground, fragments glinting like broken teeth. But it was not the broken camera that made my throat close. It was the trail in the dust behind it. Small indentations, not paw prints, not boot prints, fingers, long, splayed, dragging fingers. They led from the camera to one of the old brick arches on the far wall, a bricked-up doorway I did not remember ever seeing open. But now, the mortar around its edges was cracked, crumbling, freshly disturbed. Something had come through, or had gone in. My vision whirled. A dizzying rush of fear swept over me, strong enough that I nearly fell. The cellar was alive with presence, though none of it belonged to me. This was their place. Pickman had never been alone down here, and now, neither was I. I stumbled backward, toward the stairs. My lamp flickered madly. The tapping beneath the well grew faster, more insistent. The dragging scrape along the wall grew louder. The breath behind me, whether imagined or real, grew colder. The air thickened, the shadows swelled, and as I reached the base of the stairs, the lamp finally gave out. Darkness swallowed everything. A sound rose from the well, a sound I will never be able to fully describe. Not a growl, not a hiss. Something between a hungry inhale and a delighted whisper. It knew I was there, and in that moment, I knew the truth Pickman had tried to hide. He had painted them so perfectly because he had not merely observed them. He had lived among them, and something beneath the earth wanted me next. The moment the lamp died, darkness closed in on me like a living force, not simply absence of light, but presence thick, suffocating, as if shadows had grown weight and wrapped themselves around my body. I staggered backward onto the lowest stair, my hands gripping the banister as though it were the only real thing left in the world. For several seconds, I could hear nothing but my own ragged breathing. Then, slowly, the cellar began to speak again, a faint shuffling. Not from the well now, from the walls. Something moved behind the bricks, slow, deliberate motions, too heavy for rats, too knowing for mere animals. The sound slithered through the darkness, shifting from one corner to another, as though whatever lurked there was circling me, testing the boundaries of its approach. A bead of sweat slid down my temple. My throat tightened until swallowing became painful. Every instinct screamed to flee, but I could not force myself to move. The dark itself felt alive, pulsing with anticipation. Then, from the direction of the bricked-up archway, came a soft but unmistakable scrapestone grating against stone. Something was pushing through. My breath caught. I pressed myself against the stair, desperate for a glimpse, any clue of what might emerge. But the darkness was absolute. A second scrape echoed, louder this time, followed by a low, guttural sound, something between a grunt and a hiss. The air grew colder. Something had entered the room. I did not see Pickman return at first. I only realized he was there when a sudden wrenching sound echoed behind me, metal striking stone. A door slamming shut. His footsteps were hurried, almost frantic, as though he had run from something rather than toward me. "Do not make a sound," he whispered sharply. His voice was trembling. Pickman, whose laughter once mocked fear, who had spoken of horrors as though they were familiar neighbors, was trembling. I felt his hand grip my shoulder, anchoring me in the dark. His touch was cold and rigid. "Stay absolutely still." Something moved again in the center of the cellar. The scrape became a shuffle, the shuffle a dragging, labored breath. The air shifted, heavy with an earthy smell, like wet soil mixed with something sour. I bit down hard on my tongue to keep from crying out. Pickman's grip tightened. "Don't breathe too loudly," he murmured. My heart pounded so violently I worried the sound alone might draw whatever lurked there. A low grunt reverberated across the cellar, followed by a wet clacking sound like claws testing the stone. Then footsteps, heavy, uneven, walking across the cellar floor. Not scurrying, not skittering, walking. My skin crawled so violently my vision seemed to blur despite the pitch black. Pickman's hold on my shoulder stiffened, his breath catching softly, almost in a wince. "It's too close," he whispered. Something brushed against a canvas. The frame rattled. Another grunt rose, curious, sniffing. I heard the faint scrape of claws, long claws dragging up the side of the easel. The unfinished painting shifted. A brush rolled on the floor. Then silence. Not peace, but listening. It was listening for us. I dared not breathe. Pickman lowered his mouth close to my ear, speaking in the faintest whisper, barely audible. "They're restless tonight. The storm must be moving in." A memory hit me, distant thunder the night of our first visit. The creatures were always loudest when rain approached, as though storms stirred something primal within them. The thing in the room inhaled slowly. The sound was deep, cavernous, hollow, not human, not even remotely human. It exhaled with a wet rasp that made bile rise in my throat. Pickman's fingers dug painfully into my shoulder. "Don't move." The creature shuffled again, its claw tapping lightly as if marking the stone. I imagined it turning its head, smelling the air, listening for the tremor of our breath. Time lost meaning. The dark stretched into an abyss. My chest ached from holding air. My muscles trembled uncontrollably. Every passing second felt like standing on the edge of a cliff with the wind tugging at my balance. Then footsteps. Slow, dragging ones, moving away toward the deeper part of the cellar. A faint scraping of stone, a rustle of loose dirt, the sound of something descending into the well tunnel, sliding back into its unseen world. Pickman exhaled shakily. His grip loosened. "All right," he whispered. "It's gone. For now." But even in his whisper, I heard no relief, only strain. He let go of me and stepped forward. "I need light." He struck a match. The sudden flare revealed his face drawn, pale, eyes too wide. Not madness, worse. Recognition. A man greeting familiar terror. He lit a lantern from the wall hook. Its dim glow spread shakily across the cellar, revealing nothing unusual, no footprints, no disturbed objects. nothing to prove what we had just heard. That inconsistency terrified me more than any monstrous footprint could have. Pickman ran a hand through his hair, his expression collapsing under the weight of exhaustion. "They get braver," he muttered. "Every year they get braver." I stared at him, unable to speak. His eyes flicked to me. "You want to know what you heard?" he asked softly. "You want me to tell you what they are?" His shoulders sagged. "They're not rats." The room vibrated silently with the meaning of those words. Pickman walked toward the well, unwilling or unable to hide the familiarity in his movements. He placed a hand on the rim, not with fear, but reverence. "They came before us. Before Boston. Before the settlers. Before the tribes." His voice grew distant, as though reciting something learned long ago. "They were here when the hills formed, when the tunnels carved themselves out of the earth. They watched us build on top of them. They let us." He turned to me. "And sometimes they come up to see how we've changed." His voice broke. "They don't mean to kill, not always. They just don't understand the difference between us and them." A cold tremor ran through me. "You sound like you know them." Pickman lowered his gaze. "You paint what you know." The lantern flickered. Somewhere deep beneath the well, a faint tap echoed like a reminder. Pickman flinched. I watched him closely then. The tremor in his fingers, the way his pupils dilated when the tapping sounded again, the way he looked at the well, not with horror but with something bordering on longing. It hit me like a blow. He wasn't afraid of them. He was afraid of what he was becoming. Before I could speak, he moved toward the stairs. "We need to leave. Now." His voice had regained its edge, urgent, commanding. We ascended quickly, the lantern swinging wildly with each step. When we reached the top, he shoved me out into the hallway and pulled the cellar door shut with a force that shook the frame. For a moment, he leaned against it, chest heaving, eyes closed. "They're never this close to the surface," he murmured. "Never without reason." He opened his eyes, and I saw it, that flicker of fear so deep, so embedded, it had reshaped him. "Something's changing," he whispered. "Something's waking." We left the cellar behind us, but the cellar had not left me. Every footstep on the creaking boards felt as though something beneath the house echoed it, mimicking us, tracking us, counting the rhythm of our escape. Pickman moved quickly, with the silent urgency of a man accustomed to fleeing unseen shadows. His lantern threw long, jerking columns of light across the hallway, distorting the peeling wallpaper into grotesque faces. "Don't look back," he muttered. His voice cracked, barely audible, as if he feared the house might hear. I obeyed, though the temptation to glance over my shoulder tugged at me like a hook embedded in my spine. We reached the front door far sooner, or perhaps far later than I expected. Time had dissolved in that house. It clung to the walls like mold. When Pickman pulled the door open, cold fog poured inside as though the night itself were gasping for us. He extinguished the lantern with a swift breath. "Stay close," he said. "The streets are safer than the cellar, but not by much tonight." We stepped into the alley. The door clicked shut behind us with a softness, disturbingly like the way it had closed when I entered, as if the house itself exhaled in disappointment. Fog engulfed everything. The buildings leaned inward, their silhouettes swollen and monstrous in the mist. The lamps were dim, their halos shrinking as though smothered by invisible hands. Pickman took a sharp left turn, down a path I had not taken before. The alley twisted sharply, doubling back on itself, narrowing until I felt the brick walls brush my shoulders. It was a labyrinth one that shifted and pulsed in ways no city street ever should. "How do you know the way?" I asked, breath shivering in my throat. Pickman gave a short, hollow laugh. "You don't live down here without learning to navigate shadows." His answer did little to comfort me. He walked as though following a route he had taken countless times, yet his movements were tense, jittery, his head snapping toward every faint sound. Once, he froze entirely, raising a hand for silence. A faint scrape echoed from behind us, brick against brick, like something large dragging itself through an impossibly narrow space. Pickman's whisper was sharp. Don't acknowledge it. We kept moving. My pulse thundered in my ears. The fog distorted sound until every footstep felt doubled, mirrored by something just out of sight. I wanted to run, to escape, but the alley coiled tightly around us, trapping my panic inside its ancient stone throat. At last, the path widened into a crooked intersection of 3 alleys. A lamppost loomed above us, its iron frame eaten with rust. Light flickered weakly at its tip, revealing the wet sheen of the cobblestones. Pickman stopped beneath it, finally turning toward me. "This is where we part," he said softly. I blinked, stunned. "Already? You're not walking me back?" His expression twisted pain, resignation, fear, all braided together. "I can't leave this district tonight. They're too agitated. If I go too far, they'll follow." The words hit me like a blow. "Pickman, what are you saying?" He swallowed hard. In the dim lamplight, his pupils seemed strangely dilated, almost inhuman. "You should forget I brought you here. Forget everything you saw. Go back to your world, and leave this one alone." His voice trembled, but his eyes burned with a strange mixture of desperation and determination. "But what about you?" I asked. A small, sorrowful smile touched his lips, fragile, resigned. "I've been part of this place longer than you realize. Longer than I realize, too." He stepped backward into the fog. The mist swallowed him up, dissolving his shape into a faint silhouette. "Go," he whispered, "before they realize you're still close." Something shifted in the distance. A low scrape, followed by a muffled thump, as if something heavy had dropped from a wall. Pickman turned sharply. "Now!" I obeyed. It wasn't courage. It was survival. I ran, stumbling over slick stones, my breath ripping violently in and out of my chest. The fog seemed to claw at me, slowing me down, trying to usher me back toward the alleys from which I had fled. Every shadow felt like it might detach itself and give chase. Every echo seemed to follow too closely. When I finally reached a broader street, lined with tenements, the world felt almost normal again. Lamplight glowed steadier. Footsteps, human footsteps, echoed faintly from distant blocks. I did not stop until I reached the more modern part of the city, where paved streets reflected the steady glow of electric lights. By the time I reached my apartment, dawn was leaking across the horizon, a dull gray light like the sky had aged overnight. My body trembled violently, exhaustion and terror wrestling for control. I collapsed onto the nearest chair, staring blankly at the floor as if expecting it to pulse beneath me again. And then I felt something in my coat pocket, a crumpled shape, cold, slightly damp. For a moment, I could not breathe. I reached into the pocket slowly, my fingers brushing the edge of thin paper. I pulled it out. The photograph, the same one I had tried to remove from the canvas before the cellar went dark. The same one I had thought I left behind in the chaos. Its edges were curled, its surface smudged, but the image was unmistakable. The creature, slouched, canine, its jaw clamped around its victim, and behind it, the faint outline I had overlooked before now stood out clearly, because the lamplight in my room caught it just right. A human figure in the background, not hiding, not captured accidentally, standing close to the monster, watching it. The silhouette was unmistakable. Pickman. My blood turned cold, my lungs seized. The room seemed to tilt around me. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't documenting them. He wasn't surviving them. He was with them. He belonged to them, or he was becoming one of them. A faint tapping sounded beneath my floorboards, soft, rhythmic, familiar, and I understood, with a clarity colder than winter stone, that Pickman had not led me away to protect me from them. He had led me away so he could return to where he truly belonged. And they knew how to find me now. I don't remember how long I sat there, staring at the photograph. Seconds, minutes, perhaps hours. Time had lost its structure, unraveling into loose threads like the frayed edges of the image crumpled in my hand. The room around me blurred, its corners softening as though reality itself had begun to retreat. The only thing sharp, brutally sharp, was that silhouette behind the creature, Pickman, standing beside the thing, nearer than any sane man would dare, with an ease that should have been impossible. I felt something deep in my chest collapse, some last fragile barrier of reason I had held on to all this time. Every word he had spoken returned to me, not as a warning or an eccentric boast, but as a confession hidden in plain sight. You have to paint from life. He had meant it. He had truly meant it. My fingers trembled so violently I nearly tore the photograph. The creature in the foreground, its jaws wet, its posture predatory, was painted perfectly in his artwork because he hadn't invented it. He had observed it. He had followed it. Perhaps he had even fed it. But the second revelation struck even deeper, lodging in my mind like a rusted blade. Pickman wasn't a victim of those creatures. He was a bridge, a link between their world and ours. Had he always been? Had something awakened in him because of ancestry, or because of that old Salem blood he once spoke of with unsettling pride? I remembered the stories he told of his witch ancestor, hanged hundreds of years ago, the way he spoke of tunnels beneath old Boston as though he had walked them since childhood. Maybe he had, or maybe something down there recognized him long before he recognized it. The tapping beneath my floorboards grew louder, as though responding to my spiraling thoughts. I forced myself to stand, the photograph crumpling in my fist. My legs nearly buckled. The whole floor felt alive, shifting slightly, like the slow breath of something vast beneath me. "No," I whispered, stumbling backwards. "No, no," but denial did nothing. The truth clawed deeper with every heartbeat. Pickman hadn't brought me into the North End to impress me. He hadn't shown me his hidden studio as a gesture of trust or friendship. He had been testing me, measuring whether I could handle the truth of what he lived beside, what he lived with, and what he was becoming. He had taken me to the cellar because he needed someone to see it, someone who could carry the burden of truth when he no longer could. But he had never told me I could survive it. A loud creak jolted me back. The floorboards near the corner of my room bowed slightly, a tiny movement, but enough to send electric fear through my limbs. Dust sifted upward from between the planks, drifting like ash. Something was directly beneath that spot, and it was rising. I backed away until my shoulders hit the opposite wall. My breath turned shallow. Every instinct screamed to flee, but the apartment door might as well have been miles away. My legs felt frozen, encased in dread. The floor bowed again, this time with a soft crunch of wood fibers giving way. I could hear it now, a low, throaty sound, not quite a growl, not quite a breath, something between the two, a hybrid sound of hunger and curiosity, the same sound I had heard deep in Pickman's cellar, echoing from the well, a sound that had learned my scent. The photograph slipped from my hand, landing face up on the floor. The creature's eyes stared at the ceiling, two hollow pits of recognition. I could almost imagine them turning. In a frenzy, I dropped to my knees, snatched the photograph, and shoved it into my desk drawer as though hiding it might sever its connection to the thing beneath me. I slammed the drawer shut, the wood rattling under my shaking hands. The sound below stopped. Silence fell like a trap snapping closed. I crawled backward until my back pressed against the cold wall. My eyes stayed fixed on the spot where the floor had bowed. Minutes passed, or perhaps only seconds. The quiet grew unbearable. Finally, with a quivering breath, I whispered, "Pickman, what did you do?" The truth was horrific in its simplicity. He had crossed a boundary. A human body can rot. A human soul can corrupt. A human mind can be shaped by the hands of darkness. Pickman had opened a door, and now that door would never close. In the days that followed, if one can call them days, I found myself unable to enter a basement. Even looking down the stairwell to the apartment cellar made my blood run cold. I avoided subway stations with a terror that bordered on paralysis. The very idea of trains running through deep tunnels, surrounded by the crushing dark, filled me with visions of howling shapes chasing along the tracks below the platforms. Nightmares came relentlessly. In them, Pickman crouched on the ceiling like a grotesque gargoyle, his eyes mismatched, one human, one gleaming with feral light. In others, I crawled through endless tunnels, the walls pulsing like living muscle. I always awoke gasping, half convinced that my room had been replaced by the cellar beneath his studio. But the worst part was the photograph. No matter how deeply I buried it in the drawer, its presence felt palpable, like a heart still beating beneath the wood. Sometimes I thought I heard a faint tapping against the drawer's inner walls, as though something inside the photograph wanted out. And I knew, horribly, irrevocably, that Pickman had known this would happen. He knew the image would haunt me. He knew I would understand what it meant. He knew that once a man saw the truth beneath Boston, once he glimpsed the things that lived beneath its foundation, he could never return to ignorance, never return to peace. One evening, I forced myself to open the drawer again, driven by a mixture of dread and necessity. The photograph lay untouched, but the air above it felt colder. I lifted it slowly. The creature's face stared back at me, the tunnel wall behind it, the shadow of Pickman, unmistakable. But something new, a detail I had not noticed or had not existed before, caught my attention. In the far background, behind them both, a faint third shape emerged, its edges blurred, its form coiled low. Not a shadow, not a trick of light. A second creature, watching the first, watching Pickman, watching the camera, watching me. My breath stopped. The photograph fell from my hand and fluttered to the floor. That was the moment I realized the truth that chilled me deeper than any sound in the cellar. The creatures had not been looking at the victim. They had been looking at the photographer, and if Pickman had stood among them long enough to capture such a moment, then the transformation, whatever form it took, had already begun. The tapping beneath my floor resumed, soft and deliberate. It was no longer the tapping of claws. It was the tapping of fingers, human fingers, or something close. As we reach the end of these 3 haunting tales, one thing becomes unmistakably clear. Lovecraft never relied on simple monsters or sudden horrors. Instead, he invited us into a slow descent, a quiet erosion of certainty, until we begin to question not only the world around us, but the fragile boundaries of our own minds. Pickman's ghastly artistry, the nameless wanderer confronting his own identity, and the cursed legacy beneath Tempest Mountain all share the same chilling thread. The terror we fear most is rarely the creature in the dark, but the realization that the world is far older, stranger, and more indifferent than we dare imagine. Lovecraft's ghouls are not simply beasts lurking underground. They are reflections of ancestral fears, forgotten histories, and the uncomfortable truth that humanity is not always at the center of the story. And yet, despite the dread, there is fascination, there is wonder, that uneasy thrill of brushing against the unknown, of daring to peek behind the curtain of our comfortable reality. These stories remind us why dark fiction endures. It lets us explore the shadows from the safety of a single, flickering light. If you enjoyed this journey into Lovecraft's eerie universe, where art breathes, shadows watch, and ancient things remember, consider supporting the channel. Make sure to subscribe to Havelin Storytime, hit the notification bell, and join us as we continue diving into the most captivating, unsettling, and unforgettable stories ever written.